Imagine a doctor receives a body for post-mortem that appears to have passed away naturally because there are no visible wounds or markings on the outside. But upon examining the insides, the organs appear to have been torn apart. Food from the intestine had been ripped outside and a hole in the heart. Greg Flanagan of Lafayette lay was having a calm and relaxed evening in his hotel room, room 348 at the MCM Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas, on Wednesday, September 15, 2010. The evening's plans included watching Iron Man 2, eating some candy, smoking a few cigarettes, and lounging on his bed. Not that this was an unusual evening for Flanagan. Together with his brother Michael, he had founded the prosperous oil land leasing company, OGM Land Company, in Beaumont, Texas. As a result, Flanagan would usually drive from Lafayette to the Houston region on Monday mornings to begin his work week, then return to Lafayette for the weekend. When Greg Flanagan was traveling, he and his wife Susie would talk every morning. However, on September 16th, when Susie called, there was no response. Susie attempted, but was unable, to get in touch with Flanagan's colleagues by contacting them. Two of Flanagan's colleagues were concerned and drove to his hotel, knocking on Greg's door, but he didn't respond. Everyone's worst fears were unfortunately tragically confirmed when the hotel manager opened the door to room 348 to find Greg Flanagan, age 55, lying dead on the floor. Police found no signs of a break-in, no signs of a struggle, nothing was even disturbed in Flanagan's room, and there was no blood found at the scene. Other than an injury on his left cheek from his face hitting the carpet when he fell, Flanagan appeared to have no wounds. Robbery was ruled out when police discovered Flanagan's wallet, which held nearly $1,000, still in his back pocket. Substances were not discovered in his room, on him, or in his luggage, ruling out the possibility that substances had a role in Flanagan's death. Flanagan apparently drank frequently, although not excessively, and smoked a significant amount. As a result, the responding police attributed his death to natural causes. After conducting numerous interviews with other guests at the hotel, and being satisfied there was nothing left to examine or discover, police released Flanagan's body to the Jefferson County Medical Examiner for transport and autopsy. When starting the autopsy, Jefferson County Medical Examiner Dr. Tommy Brown discovered only 2 marks on Flanagan's body. Flanagan had 2 marks from his fall, a little one in his crotch area, and a larger one on his cheek. But as the examination went on, what had initially appeared to be a simple death from natural causes became something Dr. Brown was unable to explain. He said the condition of his insides reflected severe trauma. Flanagan had been beaten to death, or crushed. Brown concluded that the wound to his groin likely had been caused by a hard kick. He had also taken a blow to the chest so severe it had caused lethal damage. Clearly not what Dr. Brown was expecting to see from a death deemed to be of natural causes. At that point, Brown officially listed Flanagan's cause of death as a homicide. Dr. Brown clarified to Detective Scott Apple, the case's lead detective, that Flanagan's inside injuries were in line with those of crash victims or people discovered behind large objects. Despite Flanagan's surface injuries showing no indications of trauma and his internal injuries depicting a severe rib-cracking assault, no one who was at the hotel that night, after numerous interviews, had heard anything that would point to such a vicious attack. From hotel records, Detective Apple discovered that Flanagan had called hotel maintenance early the night before he died. Ver said that Greg had inadvertently blown an electrical circuit when using the room's microwave to make some popcorn. Documents indicate that the blown circuit had an impact on both the electricity in Flanagan's room and the room adjacent to it, room 349. The same night that Flanagan stayed at the MCM Elegante Hotel, a party of electricians from out of town checked in, 2 of them in room 349 next door. Is it possible that the breakers incident set to a physical conflict in the corridor between Flanagan and the 2 men next door? That would account for the lack of evidence of a struggle in Flanagan's room. Detective Apple returned to the hotel a little more than a week after Flanagan's death to speak with Tim Steinmetz and Lance Mueller, 2 electricians who were still working in the area and occupying room 349. According to reports, the 2 males were cooperative and helpful during the questioning. They informed Detective Apple that they thought they heard someone cough in room 348 next door when they went back to their room that evening after leaving the hotel bar. They kindly provided detectives with their cell phone numbers in case they might be of any further assistance, and they informed Detective Apple that was the only noise they had heard coming from Flanagan's room on September 15, 2010. Regretfully, it seemed that Greg Flanagan's death was closing down. That is, until Ken Brennan, a private investigator, was recruited by Greg's wife, Susie Flanagan. P.I. Ken Brennan was a DEA special agent and former Long Island police officer who had a reputation for cracking cases. With Flanagan's passing, he had a difficult one. But he was up to the challenge. In order to gather as much information as possible to begin investigating the matter, Brennan traveled to Lafayette in April 2010 to meet with Susie Flanagan. Brennan noticed something in their discourse that caught his attention. She was surprised that the room was so warm when Greg's co-workers entered it the following morning, Susie said to Brennan. At night, her spouse enjoyed turning on the air conditioning. After that, Brennan made the trip to Beaumont to meet with Detective Apple and go over the case files. Following their discussion and examination of all the evidence and images from the crime scene, Brennan notifies Apple. The way this guy died, I think I know. I think I know when he passed away. I think I know who killed him, and I think I know how we're going to catch him. While going over the evidence, Brennan noticed that Flanagan's left hand was still holding a cigarette when he passed away. He made a brief phone call to Susie, inquiring as to Flanagan's hand preference for smoking, left or right. Susie told Brennan with assurance that her husband was right-handed and that he had unquestionably always smoked with his right hand. As Brennan saw it, the air conditioner had shut down with everything else when the circuit breaker blew. Hotel records showed that their repairman had left Greg alive and well around 8:30 p.m. The movie resumed, and apparently Greg forgot to flip the AC back on. It would have taken a few minutes for the room to grow warm enough for him to notice, and by the time it had, he was dead. If Greg was right-handed, why was the cigarette found in his left hand? As Brennan pieced it together, examining the state of the room, Greg had gotten up from the bed and headed toward the door, shifting the cigarette to his left hand in order to grab the door handle with his right. Speak with Jefferson County Medical Examiner Dr. Tommy Brown was the next step. During their conversation, Detective Brennan questions Dr. Brown about the possibility that Flanagan's internal injuries were brought on by a violent beating. Yes, Dr. Brown said, suggesting that someone wearing steel-tipped boots may have been the source of the injury discovered on Flanagan's crotch. Construction boots were worn by both of the electricians in room 349. When Apple interviewed the men the day Flanagan's body was found, he didn't notice any warning signs, he tells Brennan. Unsatisfied with his explanation regarding Flanagan's demise, Brennan took the surveillance footage from the hotel back to Long Island and requested that Detective Apple conduct a second interview with the two guys from room 349 while he was away. Brennan returned to Beaumont a few weeks later, and he met with Detective Apple to discuss any new information they had found. While Apple had found something interesting in his interviews, Brennan found nothing significant in the hotel's CCTV footage. During the interview, Apple revealed to Brennan that a man named Aaron Bork, one of the crew foremen, had heard something about a gun going off. Nobody who had been previously interviewed about the disputed night had reported hearing gunfire at the MCM Elegante Hotel. Apple is promptly informed by Brennan that they must return to the MCM Elegante Hotel to look for a bullet in rooms 348 and 349. After returning to the Elegante Hotel, Brennan and Apple thoroughly searched rooms 349 and 348 and discovered nothing. Brennan became irritated because, at this stage of the inquiry, he was certain that Greg Flanagan's death involved a pistol. Brennan saw some drywall patchwork on the wall shared with the next room just before he gave up. To check if the patchwork lined up the doorknob, he opened the door, but it didn't. The doorknob in the hotel room was not the source of the damage to the wall. The room next door, where the two electricians were staying the night before Flanagan died, was then swiftly inspected by him and Apple. The two investigators entered room 349 and discovered a little hole that had been filled in with what looked like toothpaste. Furthermore, the holes in rooms 348 and 349 matched one another perfectly. Those two holes were caused by a bullet. Brennan stood alongside a small neat hole in the wall that had been patched with a daub of faintly pink filler that turned out to be dried toothpaste. He measured its height against his hip, then walked back to 348 and measured the indentation. They lined up. A bullet had gone through the wall. The small, neat hole in 349 marked its entry. The larger hole in 348, its exit. Brennan came to the conclusion that Greg Flanagan was wounded in the crotch by a gunshot fired from room 349 as he was watching Iron Man 2, eating candy and smoking a cigarette while he sat on his bed. Dr. Tommy Brown, the Jefferson County medical examiner, was given information with Brennan and Apple's findings, but Brown was not convinced. Since Flanagan was cremated, there was no body to dig up and go over again, so the three guys looked at the autopsy pictures again. After a closer look at the images, it was determined that Flanagan had been shot rather than beaten, resulting in internal damage. Greg Flanagan was shot in the crotch, and the bullet passed through his internal organs before ending up in his heart, where the three men found a bullet hole. It was time to return to room 349 and talk to the two men who were staying there. Tim Steinmetz and Lance Muller, the two men who were lodging next door to Flanagan at the Elegante Hotel, had left Beaumont, Texas, at this time in the inquiry, and had returned to their native Wisconsin. Quickly after arriving in Wisconsin, Brennan and Apple set up meetings with the two men at the Chippewa County Sheriff's Office. Tim Steinmetz was interviewed first. The interview proceeded well, and after Brennan and Apple finished their questioning, they requested Steinmetz to review his statement and make any needed modifications. Steinmetz altered his statement a little bit and signed it. At that point, Apple and Brennan threatened to have him arrested for submitting a fictitious police report unless he told them the truth about what actually occurred that evening. After a few good cop, bad cop maneuvers, Steinmetz finally revealed to them what had actually occurred that evening. Steinmetz informed Brennan and Apple that he was having a drink and relaxing with two colleagues, Trent Pisano and Lance Muller, following a demanding workday. During the afternoon, Muller requested Pisano to go downstairs and retrieve his pistol, a 9mm Ruger, and a bottle of whiskey. When Pisano returned to room 349, Muller took the gun and began playing with it, eventually dropping the gun. Steinmetz says when the gun hit the floor, it fired into room 348. At the time, no one was sure if anyone was in room 348. After not hearing any noises coming from room 348, Steinmetz said they left and went down to the hotel bar to continue drinking. When Steinmetz and Muller returned to their room later that night, he says they heard someone coughing in room 348, so they assumed whoever was in the room was okay. Could Greg Flanagan have still been alive when the two men returned from the bar? Could he have been who they heard coughing inside room 348? On October 29, 2012, Lance Muller was charged with manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. If Steinmetz and Muller had told Detective Apple the truth about what happened the morning Greg Flanagan's body was discovered in room 348, it's quite likely Muller wouldn't have been charged.